We'll let the conference begin. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you one of the founding fathers of ecological economics, Bob Costanza, who will be giving our opening plenary oration. Bob is Professor and Chair in Public Policy at the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU. He received his PhD from the University of Florida in 1979 in systems ecology with a minor in economics. He also has a master's degree in architecture and urban and regional planning from the University of Florida. He's held a range of prestigious positions at the Universities of Maryland and Vermont. His transdisciplinary research integrates the study of humans and the rest of nature to address research, policy and management issues at multiple timescales and from small watersheds to the Earth system. Bob is co-founder of the International Society for Ecological Economics, founding editor-in-chief of Solutions, a certified senior ecologist in the Ecological Society of America, and is a senior fellow of the Stockholm Resilience Centre. Please join with me in welcoming Bob.
Hello, thank you all. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. And today I want to talk about ecosystem service science. I'm assuming that in this audience, most of you have at least heard the term ecosystem services. Who here has at least heard the term and is familiar with this idea a little bit? Okay, that's close to 100%, good. So I'll talk about some aspects of it and why it's so important, and I think why we need especially ecologists, to get even more involved in this way of framing some of these wicked problems that we're facing. You probably also heard the term Anthropocene before. Who's heard that term in the audience? Okay, good. So definitely preaching to the converted here, but hopefully it won't be preaching. So you know that things have changed dramatically. We don't live in an empty world any longer. This is even more reason why we can't ignore the connections between humans and the rest of nature. And I say it in that way just to emphasize the fact that we are part of nature as well. And our challenge going forward is really how do we construct, how do we design a future that is both sustainable and desirable. I think we don't want a future that's going to last that is not desirable. I think the current situation is not as good as we can do. But we also want something that can last, and certainly our interdependence with the rest of nature is a critical component there that needs to be brought more into line. Certainly, business as usual in this Anthropocene is not an option. It's not going to be sustainable. It's also not desirable. So how do we move beyond that? I think ecosystem services, natural capital are a key way of reframing this issue that can help us move forward to recognize and try to quantify and value to the extent possible the degree of interdependence, the degree to which humans benefit from functioning ecosystems. You've probably seen this diagram from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that came out a few years. That just is one way of categorizing those services, and they break it into these 4 categories of provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting services. And we heard a bit earlier about some of the cultural services, the spiritual and recreational kinds of services that ecosystems provide. But I think there's something missing from this diagram. So it sort of implies that ecosystems just provide these constituents of well-being, and what's missing, I think, is the interaction with the other forms of capital assets that we also require. This dry climate is getting to me. So I think it's important to recognize those interactions, and I think the whole point of ecosystem service science is really to integrate the contributions of not just our natural capital, all of our ecosystems and everything they do, but also the other types of assets that are necessary in interaction to produce these sustainable human well-being, the benefits that humans get. from natural ecosystems. So this implies that ecosystem service science is inherently a transdisciplinary kind of approach. You can't approach this simply from understanding the underlying ecology. You've got to understand also the economics, the built capital, the human capital, the social capital. How do all of these things interact to produce sustainable well-being, and the relative contribution to that well-being of natural ecosystems is what we're talking about with ecosystem services. So I think there's also some mistaken identities concerning ecosystem services that we should try to clear up. First of all, when people say economics, they often confuse that with the market. I think even most economists make that mistake. In fact, economics is about a lot more than just the market. The market is simply one institution that we've developed to help manage our resources. So economics really, literally, is about the management of our household, oikos. And both ecology and economics, as you probably know, are both from the same Greek root, oikos, which means house. So ecology is the study of the house, economics is the management of the house. Those two things should really go much more closely together. But certainly don't confuse economics with just the market. Valuation is really about how do we assess the relative contribution of different items, different services to that sustainable well-being. It is not about, or does not imply, privatization or commodification or trading of these services. So, that market valuation, market exchanges, as I said, is just one institution that's part of the system, but it's not the whole system. And I think the challenge is to get out of that sort of mode of thinking. These values can be expressed in many different ways, including in monetary units. And that's just one convenient way of expressing the values. It does not imply that those are market values or that they came from exchanges. In fact, the whole point of valuing ecosystem services is to get outside the market and look at all of the things that are important to us that aren't exchanged in markets and shouldn't be exchanged in markets, but that are nevertheless extremely valuable. This idea of ecosystem services, I think, is really getting some traction recently. You may have heard of this intergovernmental science policy platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. It's a real mouthful. IPBES, I think, is the way it's currently usually being pronounced. This is the IPC equivalent for ecosystem services. And I think this is really starting to get underway. Some of you may have been involved in this already, or certainly interested. Another institution that I've been involved in trying to get going is the Ecosystem Services Partnership. We just had our 7th international meeting in San Jose, Costa Rica, and I would direct you to this website if you want to learn more about everyone who's doing work in this area. The idea behind this partnership is really to form a platform for people to exchange ideas. And not just scientists, but scientists and practitioners and policymakers and stakeholders, et cetera. So it's more than an academic society. It's a way to sort of build these ideas and move forward. In the science community has certainly picked up on this idea of ecosystem services. There's a new journal by that title, and this is just the number of publications. It's a little outdated, actually. I think there's more than 12,000 papers that have been published so far on this topic of ecosystem services. So it's beginning to get quite a bit of traction. And I think it's also important to point out that this idea of valuing and quantifying the contribution of ecosystem services to human well-being has a number of different uses. And the characteristics of how we do the valuation, I think, varies or should vary depending on which use it's being applied to. The first one there, just simply raising awareness and interest about ecosystem services, I think is an extremely important one. But as you'll see, it doesn't necessarily require a high degree of precision. There are also important uses in national income accounting. The Australian Bureau of Statistics is now involved in trying to incorporate ecosystem services and natural capital into the national income accounts. And I'll show a little bit about some of the implications of doing that sort of thing towards the end of the talk. Certainly analyzing specific policies, analyzing urban and regional land use changes and global land use changes, I think are also important uses of this approach. The idea of payment for ecosystem services, which has been applied in several countries quite successfully. Costa Rica is probably the leader in doing this, and they managed to reforest the country essentially by implementing a system of paying landowners for replanting and protecting forests in order to provide water and biodiversity and tourism and other services. But that idea is also becoming quite popular. Going down to the last one on the list, I think that idea of payment needs to be embedded in a more comprehensive sort of institutional arrangement. And this idea of a common asset trust, that we should think of these common assets like ecosystems, like the atmosphere, like the oceans, as being property of all of us, but to be held in trust, not something that can be exchanged in conventional markets. And finally, this idea of full cost accounting, I think, is also getting quite a bit of traction within the business community and banks and insurance companies. How do we incorporate the costs of the depletion of natural capital and ecosystem services into everything that we're doing? So full cost accounting, I'll say a little bit more about all of these potential uses as we go along. So you probably saw this paper somewhere along the line that we did back in 1997, where we tried to synthesize, it's kind of a meta-analysis of all of the studies that had been done at the time on ecosystem services, and we came up with an estimate with a capital E of about $33 trillion a year, significantly larger than global GDP, and almost certainly an underestimate of the total contribution of ecosystem services. So I think this made the point. This was definitely an awareness-raising exercise, and also a plea for more research, because this was an important issue. But it certainly made the point that natural ecosystems were not just a pretty picture. These were supporting human well-being in ways significantly larger and more important than the whole conventional economy put together. There's one thing we didn't control in that process, and that was what they put on the cover of the magazine, and they said, pricing the planet. Well, we didn't really mean that. We meant valuing the planet in ways that are different than that I've already talked about. Unfortunately, I think that may have caused some confusion. More recently, we, as part of the TEEB study, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, there was a lot of work in updating all of the studies, collecting all of the studies that had been done since then. And this paper that came out was a synthesis of all of the new studies. And let's see, I think you can see over here, this is sort of the number of studies that went into the estimates of the mean and standard deviation for each of those systems. You notice that there's one or two that are still missing from that list that have been not studied well enough, I guess, to include. But you can see also that there's quite a range and quite large mean values, especially for some of the marine and coastal systems. More recently than that, we took those new estimates and tried to estimate the changes in the total global value from 1997 until this paper came out in 2011. So it's kind of an update, trying to use similar or the same techniques. And the result of that is this spreadsheet, which I know you can't see the numbers on, but I'll just tell you what went into it. And this is in the paper if you care to take a look. So it just looks at changes in land use over here from 1997 to 2011. Changes in these unit values, the total estimated value per hectare per year. You can see all the ones in green went up significantly. The ones that went down just by a small amount. And you can see there are a couple of biomes that are really missing still, that need additional work. So put that out there as a challenge to you. And then from that, we can estimate the totals, just multiplying the unit values times the areas, and look at what the total was in 1997. What happens if we change only the unit values? So we know that those unit values were underestimates, and that was certainly borne out. we know if we change only the area, we see that using the original unit values, we get a significant decrease in the total value. Some of the high-valued systems are being lost at the expense of some of the low-value systems. And if we change both, we get this number, 124 trillion a year. So the difference between this one and this one is $20 trillion a year that we've lost in terms of contribution of ecosystem services over that time period. We know that when we make some of these land use changes, this again is from the Millennium Assessment, for example, from intact wetlands to intensive farming, there's a significant loss of value. The value goes into the private coffers, of the farmers, but it's lost from the community coffers, things that are outside the market and not measured. But that loss can be estimated. Back in 2002, we tried to estimate the value or the benefit cost ratio of conserving our natural ecosystems, our natural capital. And we did that by running this global scenario that assumed increasing the global reserve network to cover 15% of the terrestrial biosphere and 30% of the marine biosphere. That would cost about $45 billion a year to build and maintain. But the benefits, the difference between the intact system and what it might be converted to, was on the order of $4 to $5 trillion a year. So a benefit cost ratio of 100 to 1. Again, fairly conservatively estimated. And I would challenge you to find a better benefit cost ratio in the economy, in any economy these days. In fact, the only one I could find was for oil companies investing in political campaigns in the United States, which unfortunately is about 400 to 1 return on investment. And that's something we need to stop. But anyway, and in doing these sorts of assessments, many of the uses for valuation that I mentioned require some sort of aggregation of these small-scale estimates up to larger values. And there's a range of techniques for doing that, including a simple benefit transfer, which is what that Nature paper and the updates used. You estimate the value per hectare per year for an average, and then just multiply that by the area. You can certainly improve on that, and these are sort of levels of sophistication and improvement. You can, get expert modified value transfer. You know that not all forests are the same; they have different characteristics. So you can employ that information to modify those estimates. If you have enough estimates of the value of these systems, you can do a more statistical approach and look at what contributes to the variation and try to reduce the variation based on other contributing factors. Or you can ultimately build more spatially explicit, more functional models of how this integrated human and natural system works. And I'll talk a little bit about a couple of these approaches. How do you value these ecosystem services? Again, this should be a very transdisciplinary approach, but here's a range of things that have been tried, ranging from things like avoided costs, and not all of these, I should say, really depend on people's perceptions of that value. I think that's one of the other mistakes that people often make, that we're not always basing this on just what people think the value is. I think a lot of it, because people don't perceive well some of these functions and values of ecosystems, it's necessary to go outside of people's current perceptions and build models of various kinds that can describe and quantify those contributions. And I'll give some examples here, but just to point out that especially the ones at the bottom, I think are interesting, that if we're asking people to value whole ecosystems, it's not necessarily appropriate to ask individuals and then try to add up the individual values. You might want to ask the whole group, the whole community in some way. And again, it's also important to get outside of perception-based valuation. I'll run through a quick example of the value of coastal wetlands for storm protection. That is an avoided cost technique, just to show you what sort of things are done in this area. This is Hurricane Katrina approaching the coast of Louisiana. We can collect the data on all the various storm tracks that have hit various parts of the world. The study that we did was for the US because we had data for that part of the world. We're now hoping to update that for Australia, China, and some other parts of the world. So one can collect data on the swath of the storm, the area of wetlands within the swath, the amount of infrastructure that's in the swath to be damaged, the intensity of the storm, and the amount of damages that are caused. And you can put that together into a simple statistical relationship that looks at this. In this case, the model is the relative damages as a function of wind speed and wetland area. And then from that, you can estimate what's the change in damages as a result of a unit change in wetland area. That allows us to explain about 60% of the variation in the relative damages of the storms that hit the U.S. And that allows us then to map both the marginal and the total value of these coastal wetlands. You can see that the high red numbers are where those three variables come together, where you have a lot of infrastructure to be protected, like around Miami, a lot of storms to be protected from, and a lot of wetlands to do the protection. And that gives you numbers that span quite a range, but with very high mean and median values per hectare per year. Certainly significantly larger than the market value for these coastal wetlands. And you can add all that up and come up with a total value of $23 billion per year just in the storm protection services of these coastal wetlands. And this sort of analysis has begun, I think, to affect the planning and management of these coastal systems. The Corps of Engineers, for example, after Hurricane Katrina, their first response was, well, let's build a big levee along the whole coast of Louisiana. That's the way to protect it from future storms. This sort of information is showing them that, by using the horizontal levees, using the natural capital as storm protection, they can get a much more cost-effective approach to doing that. Plus, they get all of the additional benefits, the other 17 or 16 different ecosystem services that constructed levees are not going to give them. So now there's much more emphasis on devising ways to redistribute the sediments from the Mississippi River back into the deltaic plain to try to restore and rebuild the coastal wetlands for all of these multiple functions. Okay, moving on to full cost accounting. I think this is another use of this valuation of ecosystem services that's beginning to get quite a bit of attention. There's a company called True Cost that I'm the chair of the advisory board to that is involved in doing just this. So they estimate the external environmental costs, the impacts on ecosystem services and human health by company. And they do that by looking at not just the company's operations itself, but the whole supply chain of the company. So everything, all the buyers, all the things, the companies they buy supplies from and the companies they buy supplies from, all the way down the chain using an input-output model of the whole global economy. And this has become quite useful, and I think has become getting quite a bit of traction. In particular, Puma has recently decided that they're going to do an environmental profit and loss statement. So they include these external costs in their profit and loss statement and make that much more obvious, not only to themselves, but also to their shareholders, to investors, et cetera. And they're encouraging other companies to do the same sort of thing. This can make a huge difference in terms of the true cost, and it affects the true cost of everything we buy. In fact, the market currently is really not telling us the truth about the cost of everything we buy because it's ignoring all of these external environmental and social costs. They did a study of just the primary processing and production sectors and estimated that there's an external cost associated with those of $7.3 trillion a year, which is a significant component just for those two sectors of the economy. Agriculture, I think, is also a significant biome that we need to begin to look at much more critically. It's a huge part of the global terrestrial surface area, and it's also one of the biomes where we could probably make the most improvement in terms of supply of ecosystem services. This is from a paper by John Foley and colleagues back in 2005 that just pointed out the difference between the production of ecosystem services versus crops and natural ecosystems versus intensive cropland. Crops go up, everything else goes down. And what we're really looking for is something that has more of a balance, that produces crops and ecosystem services in a more balanced way. And if we could begin to design and implement agricultural systems that did something more like that, we could make a huge difference, I think, in terms of the sustainability and production of food. Just to plug a recent book on ecosystem services in agricultural and urban landscapes by Steve Ratton and myself and other colleagues. You can take a look at that. So, and one application of this idea that I thought was quite good was as part of the UK ecosystem assessment that was recently done. And this was a paper by Ian Bateman and colleagues that came out in Science recently, where they looked at a range of scenarios for the UK, and they looked at these 6 scenarios based on differences in environmental regulation and planning policy and differences in the spatial focusing of changes. And you can sort of tell from the names what they were after, the world markets kind of business as usual approach versus the nature at work kind of ecosystem services approach. And what they managed to do then was to look at a subset of ecosystem services under each of those scenarios, including conventional economic production, greenhouse gas sequestration, recreation amenities, and urban green space. And for each scenario, then, they could say, well, here's what the market values, the conventional agricultural production would look like in each scenario, world markets and nature at work, just compared those two. And then here are the non-market values, the greenhouse gas, sequestration, recreation, urban green space amenities, and then also the effects on biodiversity. So they didn't include the value of biodiversity, they included the effects on biodiversity of the different scenarios. And the bottom line looks something like this, where if one only looked at maximizing market values of agriculture, which is generally what has been done, by 2060, those values go up, but other things tend to go down or don't go up as much. If you maximize all the monetary values, those market values may go down, but everything else goes up by quite a bit. So if you look at the bottom line here, there's an order of magnitude better value if one manages that national landscape for all monetary values and not just for conventional market values. And again, this is an underestimate because they're only looking at some small subset of the ecosystem services that are being provided. They also looked at what happens if you maximize all these values with a biodiversity constraint and found that that didn't reduce the production by very much. So, closer to home, we did a scenario planning assessment of the Great Barrier Reef and its catchment a few years ago. And for that assessment, we looked at these 4 scenarios based on whether the world gets its act together and starts acting on climate change, because the major effects on the Great Barrier Reef are global effects, climate change, ocean acidification, warming, et cetera, and also regional effects that have to do with how the watershed is managed. So in this case, we had the world gets its act together or not, and whether Australia gets its act together over here or not. And that gives us 4 different potential scenarios, ranging from, if nobody's getting their act together, the commons get trashed. If everybody's getting their act together, the best of both worlds, and then the 2 alternatives in between. We could then sort of map what those scenarios would look like, both in terms of terrestrial land use and also the effects on the Great Barrier Reef, and did some modeling to back that up to show what might happen under each scenario to the percent coral cover. You can see that trashing the commons does in fact trash the commons completely eventually. The other scenarios maintain coral cover at some different levels. And then we also assessed for each of those scenarios what happens to not only ecosystem services, but other contributors to human well-being on the social side and on the human capital side. And The bottom line here was, if you look at just the economic indicators, certainly trashing the commons looks best. But if you look at the whole range of well-being indicators, it's significantly worse than everything else. And the best of both worlds scenario is certainly preferable. What we're planning to do with this and with other scenario building exercises is to take it the next step and to try to get some public opinion surveys around these scenarios. What kind of future do people really want once those alternative futures are put out there? About a month ago, we did a workshop in Westernport, and I could direct you to this website to look at the full description of the scenarios that we came up with there. Again, something similar, but also there's a link to a survey that we're encouraging people to take after they've read through the scenarios to try to rank them against each other and tell us what sort of aspects of each scenario they think are better. And I think getting that part of the process out there, I think that's really what democracy should be all about. You know, how do we come to some consensus about what kind of future that we really want? And I think that consensus will be quite surprising compared to the business as usual consensus. So, let me leave that one up. So we're also doing this at the global scale to try to look at what sort of future scenarios might result in improvements or what the state of the world would be, and eventually to get those sort of scenarios out to a broader public for surveys as well. And in this case, we going back to the comparison between 1997 and 2001 that I showed earlier, we're now extending that to these 4 future scenarios in 2050. And they're a combination, kind of a synthesis of the Great Transition Initiative scenarios, some work that we've done recently, and the Bateman et al. Scenarios that I showed earlier. These scenarios of the future tend to revolve around a set of archetypes or common characteristics so that allowed us to do this. And there's a market forces scenario, there's a policy reform where government sort of takes stronger action. The Great Transition is really the sustainability scenario, and then Fortress World is where things go wrong. And from the Great Transition work, we were able to estimate the area of each of these biomes going forward into 2050. And it looks like this, if you want to put it against a couple axes. Is there an emphasis on individuals versus an emphasis on communities? Is there a focus on economic growth, or is there a focus more on more comprehensive well-being? And that gives you the 4 scenarios there. So from that, we can estimate the land areas in 97, 2011, and then for each of the scenarios going forward. Again, red is things that go down, and green is areas that go up. And from that, we can then plot out, this is maybe an easier way to look at it, what happens to the land areas over time of those biomes. Under the Great Transition, coral reefs would recover. We're talking about the best of both worlds scenario versus the fortress world and market forces where things deplete down to 0. Forest area does something like this. I'll just click through these quickly. But you begin to get the picture that under the Great Transition Initiative, grass and rangelands are maintained as being depleted. Wetland areas are rebuilt significantly. Deserts are decreased slightly. Urban areas only go up slightly. Cropland area doesn't change very much in either case, but again, these are big numbers, so it's still a significant absolute amount of change. And ultimately, we're looking for forms of agriculture that are not just changing the area, but also changing the way agriculture is managed. And going back to the diagram I showed from John Foley, we want to go from something that emphasizes just crop production to something that we're calling optimally diverse and sustainable agriculture that actually increases the production of all of the ecosystem services and crops. And when you do that, Then we can estimate the total flow values from 1997 and 2011 compared to these 4 scenarios. And you can see, and this is preliminary, so don't write any of this down yet, but you can see that that reduction of $20 trillion a year can be significantly reversed under this scenario of the Great Transition, or it could be significantly worsened under the market forces or the fortress world scenario. And it could be stabilized under the policy reform sort of government scenarios. And this is what it looks like plotted out over time. So I think our challenge going forward is to really begin to build a picture of what this scenario can look like. How do we build a world that is both sustainable and desirable, that recovers and restores the value of our natural capital and ecosystem services, because that does contribute to human well-being, and emphasize that we do have a choice, that people have a choice to make about what kind of future that we really would like to see. Ultimately, I think we need to do a much better job of modeling these interconnections to understand how they're connected to each other. This scenario planning gives us a way to get started there, but we really need to be able to better evaluate those scenarios. And there's been some work on doing integrated human and natural system models, this one at the global scale, that looks at the connections between all of the natural capital components and ecosystem services and the whole human system. And I point this out because by looking at these interconnections, we've estimated the value, the contribution of ecosystem services to be significantly larger than the simple benefit transfer approach comes up with. You can also do this at the landscape scale, obviously, and I think probably many of you are involved in some version of landscape modeling. The point here is, how do you include the human and built capital components into this integrated landscape modeling so that we can begin to talk about what effects different policies have on ecosystem services. There's a whole number of tools that are being created to do just that. And I didn't increase the font size on this because I don't want you to read the whole thing, but just to recognize that there's lots of things out there. I'll just point to this one that we've been working on called MIMES, Multi-Scale Integrated Models of Ecosystem Services. I think this is kind of the direction that things need to go in. How do we build models that include all of these components and their interactions over time, over space, that are scalable both temporally and spatially, and that can begin to answer some of the questions that we're after. One interesting example you might want to look at is this model we did of the Maya civilization. So if one's interested in understanding sustainability, it's good to have situations that were not sustainable. And this is an integrated agent-based and process-based model of the Maya that looked at a whole range of things, including population and ecosystem services and the trade network, and was able to replicate the response to the drought cycles from which they recovered until they didn't. So why did this collapse occur? And according to this model, it was a combination of things: that decreasing ecosystem services, overextension of the trade network, increasing population, et cetera. What can we learn from these kinds of models to help us build better, more comprehensive models of the current situation to understand sustainability and or collapse? Another issue with models is that they tend to be used only by the researchers, and it's hard to get them out into the general public. So we've been working on how to build these models, these more sophisticated models, into entertaining games that people can play, that can also be used to give us information about how people do value the trade-offs in these natural systems, and also educate them at the same time about what we mean by ecosystem services and how they vary. So we have an ongoing research agenda that has to do with developing integrated games that can combine entertainment, and the statistics are that we currently spend about 3 billion hours a week playing computer games. So if we could get some small fraction of that time to be spent playing integrated games that we can use for research purposes, but also that will be educational, then I think that can really help things. So if you can think of the Maya game that one could play, but we can keep track of every decision that people make when they're playing that game, and we can try to understand the trade-offs that they make, and also how those trade-offs change as they learn more about how the system functions by playing the game multiple times. Okay, and I will end with a little bit of discussion about national income accounting and what sort of difference it can make to include the value of natural capital and ecosystem services into that accounting. This is a short piece we did in Nature a little bit ago that argued that GDP it's certainly time to leave GDP behind. GDP was never designed as a measure of economic well-being. It only measures activity in the market. And so if there's more crime, if there's more pollution, GDP goes up. Not exactly what we want to use as a measure, as a policy goal. But unfortunately, it is the major policy goal being used by most countries today. How do we get past that and start to measure something more like what we really want? So one option or one alternative is something called the Genuine Progress Indicator, or originally the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare. What it does is start with personal consumption expenditures, which is a major component of GDP, but then it weights them by income distribution. So GDP has no weighting. If Bill Gates made all the GDP in the world, it would be exactly the same as if it were equally distributed among everyone. But if you're talking about welfare instead of income, a dollar's worth of income to a rich person doesn't produce as much additional welfare as a dollar's worth of income to a poor person. So you've got to weight it by income distribution. Then it adds a few things that are left out: the value of household labor and volunteer work, good things, but not marketed. And then it subtracts a whole bunch of things that shouldn't really be counted as positive, including some human capital components, the loss of leisure time, the cost of commuting, cost of crime, social capital components. All these things in green are natural capital components. So the costs of air and water pollution and loss of wetlands and farmlands, et cetera. Not the perfect indicator by any means, and this was really constructed to be something that could be estimated relatively easily over time so that we could compare it with GDP. And this is what you get when you do that comparison for the US. GDP is in blue. It's sort of continued upwards since the 1950s, since the post-war period. GPI sort of tracked it for a while until about 1980 or so, and then has been sort of level or trending down ever since there. So all of these additional costs, the worsening income distribution in the US since 1980, the air and water pollution costs, have all begun to outweigh the benefits of that increasing production and consumption. Some governments have taken this seriously. The state of Maryland in the US has adopted the GPI as one of their official state statistics. And if you want to learn more about this, I would direct you to this website. They do a very good job of explaining not only the data that went in, but also the policies that they're implementing at the state level to improve their GPI, not their GDP. The state of Vermont has also adopted the GPI. Several other states in the US are also looking to do that. More recently, we, myself and colleagues, synthesized all of the GPI studies that have been done around the world, and they've been done for 17 different countries. This is Australia at the top of the heap here. Most of them exhibit this sort of threshold behavior, and we also compared that with some other well-known indicators. This is on a relative scale for the United States, looking at GDP versus GPI, which tracked it quite well until 1980, as we said, and then leveled off, and then compared with life satisfaction from surveys, which has been going down quite significantly, biocapacity, ecological footprint, and HDI. Now check out, this scale, from 100 to 160 for the US. This is what it looks like for China. It goes from 100 to 350. Or 400 almost on GDP. So China's GDP has been going through the roof, but their GPI was tracking that till about 1995 and then has leveled off as well. And if you've been to Beijing or Shanghai recently, you realize that the air and water pollution costs of this tremendous economic growth are really outweighing the benefits. So we synthesized all of that into a global estimate of GPI per capita compared with GDP per capita, and you get a picture that looks a lot like the US picture. And we know that the conclusion from that is that we're not really growing even in an economic sense. We're in a period of what Herman Daly has called uneconomic growth, where the economy's increasing in size and activity, but it's not really economic in the sense that it's not improving well-being or welfare, more comprehensively estimated. So I'm thinking of starting an economic growth deniers club so that whenever they go on TV and start talking about we need more economic growth, I can say, well, I don't think we've had any economic growth, really. If you really want economic growth, you're going to want, improvement in welfare and well-being, and so you'd better be using some different indicators to go forward. So anybody who wants to join that club, let me know. So finally, to get a sustainable and desirable economy in society and nature, well, first of all, we have to recognize that there is this embeddedness, but it's also going to require that we break our addiction to this growth at all costs economic paradigm, to GDP, to fossil fuels, to overconsumption. And I think it is a form of addiction at the social level. We're so tied in to the whole system that explains why sort of pointing these things out is not the answer ultimately. It's just the first stage in a therapeutic process. And what we have learned from treating addictions at the individual scale is that the worst thing you can say to an addict is you're doing the wrong thing, you got to stop, you're killing yourself, etc. That immediately provokes a defensive denial kind of reaction, which is exactly the kind of reaction we were getting from society by saying that climate change is real and it's going to destroy the planet. It's all true, but it's maybe not the right way to frame the problem in order to get the kind of response that we want. So to break the addiction, I think we need to reframe the argument in a more positive way and say that let's envision a more sustainable and desirable future that focuses on quality of life, which is what people really want anyway. Consumption of goods and services is really only a means to that end, and in some cases it has a lot of negative side effects, as we pointed out, and that recognizes the contributions of natural and social capital more significantly. So that's going to require that we have a sustainable scale of the economy that respects the planetary boundaries and ecological limits, that has a much more fair distribution of resources, that gets past the increasing inequality of that resource distribution, and that has a much more efficient allocation of resources that incorporates the value of natural and social capital. So all three of these dimensions and goals require a much more sophisticated understanding of natural capital, ecosystem services, and how they contribute to human well-being over time and space. And I'll just plug this recent book that is a collection of essays from a number of well-known people around the world that try to paint the picture of what that world could look like, and I think that's something we need to do more of, not just explain it with graphs and charts, but to say, here's what it would be like to live in that world and why it would be a better place to live than where we are now or where we seem to be headed. And we've also started a journal called Solutions, which was mentioned earlier, and I would encourage you to take a look at this, where we're trying to have a venue for discussion of what these possibilities would look like, what do real solutions to some of these problems actually entail, and how can we have an ongoing dialogue about those solutions. So take a look at this. It's all available for free online as well. Whoops. So thank you very much.
plenty of time for questions. So who would like
Plenty of time. Whoa.
Plenty of time.
How can we convince the world that growth is not what we think we have to do? How can we convince economics and economists that growth is not the only solution to everything?
Well, that's what I was trying to explain here. And I think it's partly pointing it out, with these alternative indicators and things, but I think it's also to the larger world, which are not academics and don't read this sort of stuff. I think we need, the help of Hollywood, and advertising, and how do we paint that picture? I think our surveys of alternative futures might help, because it begin to get people to think about the fact that there are different alternative futures. There's different worlds that we could choose, and to sort of start that thought process. But I think it's also important to get, to get that picture painted in a more compelling way. So, if we could get some Hollywood producers to produce a movie that's set in a positive, near-term future with some big-name actors and a nice plot, those sorts of things I think could probably go further than a lot of our academic exercises. But it's not either or. It certainly you need both, and we need all of these things.
Robert, you mentioned that in choosing our future, we have to break the addiction to growth at all costs and fossil fuels and overconsumption. Where does the issue of choice about population growth come into this picture?
Sorry, say that again.
Where do choices about population growth come into your scenario about choosing our alternative future? You've mentioned we've got to break the addiction to fossil fuels and overconsumption. Where does population growth come into your future?
Okay. Well, yeah, I think in my view, population needs to be stabilized, and we actually have a nice piece that came out in Solutions not too long ago that points out that it wouldn't be that hard actually to stabilize population if we simply eliminated all of the unwanted pregnancies in the world. And how do we do that? Well, we educate particularly females, and give them more control over reproduction and give them access to the means of controlling that. And that is it's a policy decision that we could easily make. I think maybe it goes back to the envisioning and scenario planning exercises that most people don't see that there are potential alternatives to this issue and to many of the other issues that we're talking about. And that certainly a world with more people would be, more resources used, more consumption. It's going to exacerbate some of the problems that we're facing. Is that the most sustainable and desirable future, or is a world with a limited population going to be more preferable? So I think. Again, maybe it's the sort of addiction therapy as well, that the message that we've been putting forward is, population growth is a problem. It's going to crash the system eventually. We've got to stop doing it. That's something that people will not react necessarily favorably to and try to deny, whereas if we put the issue in a different way and said, if we want a better world, then here are some possibilities. And one of those attributes of this better world that we want is that population has stabilized.
Thanks very much for painting us that picture with the best tools that we currently have to see the scenarios that we might be facing in the future. And I think that, of course, most people in this room would see the need for change, and you've been discussing ways of bringing about that change. What I'm wondering is, when you bring all these, modelling and spatial and data tools to bear, have you looked at what they say about the question of the consequences of delaying action? Or delaying, you've spoken about, you know, bringing in different scenarios in the future. What happens if we do affect change, but that doesn't happen for another decade or another 30 years or another 50 years, etc.?
Well, I think that's exactly what the scenario analysis can do. It basically says, if we continue with business as usual, here's what we can expect. I think that makes the point, you know, very clearly, and sort of painting that picture in as much detail as we can, I think, will help to emphasize that point. You know, that here are the costs of not acting or continuing to act in the same way, compared to doing things differently.
I can see you presenting information about different times at which action might occur.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe you're saying that you wanted to see more detail in the scenarios about when things happened and when they didn't happen, which is what goes into some of these scenario planning exercises, because usually they end up being a narrative description, you know, of the world at some point in the future, and also something about how we got there. And so you sort of inject these decision points into the scenario. Again, scenarios are not about projections or what, you know, will happen, but they're saying here are plausible futures that could happen, and here's what would have to happen at certain times in order to get to those plausible futures.
Stephen Piketty, in his recent book on the distribution of capital in the 21st century, shows this distinct trend back towards the uneven distribution of capital globally. What do you think that means for natural capital?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm having a hard time hearing, I think, because of the echo in the microphone. But I think the question was about Thomas Piketty's recent book, Capital in the 21st Century, where he goes into what's happened with built capital, essentially, over extended time periods back to the 16th, 17th century in some countries, and also what's happened to the distribution of income and capital over time and what might happen into the future. And I think that's all perfectly consistent with what I'm talking about. But the point is, how do you add on to that what's happened to natural capital and what's happened to social capital and the other components of well-being? So it's still very much in the conventional economic perspective of built capital and income are really the only important thing, and everything else is, you know, is kind of marginal. So I think that, but it's still, you know, a good analysis of the built capital component. One thing that we're trying to do is to build a more comprehensive picture of not only the history of the world in terms of those 4 types of capital, but also projections into the future. So, yeah.
Yes, I come from a background of lobbying politicians on the environment for the last 40 years, and it's a hard job. And I've come to the conclusion you can have all the good ideas in the world and you can put them to politicians, but unless you can lay out for them the personal consequences for them if they don't follow that particular course of action, you're never going to get anywhere. Particularly in Western democracies, and especially here in Australia, they adopt the attitude of, well, they would say that anyway. So unless you can say, unless you do this, you personally are going to be in trouble. It's going to be a very hard ask.
Well, maybe let me turn that around a little bit, because I think the problem is that the politicians are not putting out compelling visions for the future that people really want, and so I think it's more a process of getting the public to understand that there are broader possibilities, and so that they'll support politicians who are putting those sorts of possibilities on the table. The current politicians are certainly not doing that, and they're sort of addicted to the system as it is. But what we're talking about is the need for a major transformation in that system. The current political structure is something that has to be at least, I don't know about change, what has to be gotten around at least to some extent. We have to come up with a different way of framing these issues that's not just go to the currently elected politicians and try to convince them that we need a major change. Like you say, I think they're not going to buy into that unless you can say why that's going to benefit them personally. But that's part of the problem. It's not part of the solution.
Probably leading on from that, I was at a workshop recently in New Zealand, and it was a life cycle assessment workshop. And one of the presenters stood up and gave a case that Bunnings, a local hardware giant, had bought an apple orchard because they couldn't buy into the local city. And the council took them to court because Bunnings wanted to demolish the apple orchard. And the council used Ecosystem Services to argue their case successfully. So that's a local government council using Ecosystem Services. Is there any other examples of a higher government or around the world like this?
Did you get that?
Yeah, it's difficult. The microphone is difficult up here to
It's
hear.
somehow
so maybe
echoing. Yeah.
just-
One government giant Bunnings in Australia and New Zealand recently used a case. They bought an apple orchard in New Zealand because they wanted to do a development for their local hardware store, and the local council said no. And so Bunnings took them to court and used their local council used Ecosystem Services as a reason as to why the local giant couldn't build their hardware store. And the case was successful in favour of the council. So the local government using Ecosystem Services. Are there any other examples of that around the world?
So you're saying the local government used ecosystem services and it was or was not successful? Yeah. I think there are lots of examples where ecosystem services are being used successfully to change policies. I'm thinking in urban context, the idea that riparian buffers around streams in urban areas are much more valuable than trying to channelize the stream and use every bit of land right up to the border. If you start looking at the flood control benefits and et cetera. So I think it's being used in a whole number of different contexts. Also, one that I maybe would like to point out is this idea of uncertainty about the impacts from different activities. And I think one of the problems there is that the burden of proof is usually on the public, as to what the impacts are going to be, and we can't do anything until there's been damages, and then we try to recover those. An alternative would be to charge assurance bonds, prior to any activity that are large enough to cover the potential damages. And that sends the right signal. It changes the burden of proof to the developers. So if we had an assurance bond high enough to cover damages to the Great Barrier Reef, from the Abbott Point, I think that would change things significantly. And they would either really do things, more cautiously, or do it, somewhere else completely that didn't have the potential impacts. But the problem is that developers are not facing the full costs of their activities, and certainly not the potential risky damages that they're subjecting the public to.
We'll have three more questions.
Yeah.
Thanks. In the current climate change debate, the Australian government has taken the view that we're a small contributor and there's not very much that we can do on our own, and I don't necessarily agree with that. I'm asking, is there a similar impediment that can be argued for any of this adoption of ecosystem services as the centre to global economics, or I'd just like your view on that? In the current climate change debate,
Thank you.
the Australian government has taken the view that we're a small contributor, there's not much that Australia can do on its own.
Okay.
I'm wondering if a similar argument is any impediment to Australia adopting a ecosystem services centred economic system.
Well, maybe, except that I think a lot of those services are they benefit local people, whereas climate change is a global benefit and it's a local cost. So that's the argument that's being used. Why should we contribute, locally when everyone else, it's the world that's benefiting? Many other ecosystem services are much more local in their benefits. So I think that argument doesn't work very well there. But even for climate change, I think we need to think of the world, and we need to think of the atmosphere as a global commons. And actually, there's some interesting work going on there about something called the public trust doctrine, where a different way of looking at these common assets, including the atmosphere. And the public trust doctrine points out that it's the fiduciary responsibility of governments to protect these common assets, and they can't privatize them, they can't offload that responsibility. So government should really start claiming damages for damages to the atmosphere. And actually, at the conference in Costa Rica that we went to, let's see if this is still going. Or do you turn it off? I had one more slide. Anyway, there's a declaration from the conference that we should claim the sky, essentially, that the atmosphere should be a common asset held in trust for all of humanity. And once you do that, you say, well, it's a form of property. It's just common property, and anybody who damages. Oh, there you go. So we had a declaration that the first minister of the environment in Costa Rica put together. This is the short version, but there's a longer version explaining this. That may be a way to sort of overcome this roadblock in the climate negotiations, that we can just start charging, the 90 companies that produce 2/3 of the carbon emissions in the world. We can start charging them for the damages more directly, rather than country by country negotiations. Countries can come together, and it can be a set of co-trustees. It doesn't have to be all countries. All countries are co-trustees to the atmosphere, so they can get a subset together to start claiming these damages, and at least start making this point, that damaging the atmosphere is damaging all of us because it's a community asset that contributes significant ecosystem services. Andrew.
Bob, you mentioned that the 100-to-1 return on protecting nature was topped only by the return to oil companies from funding political campaigns.
Can you not use the microphone? I can't understand it. Something.
You mentioned that you get 100-to-1 return on conserving nature, but oil companies get much better than that for funding political campaigns.
Yeah.
We've seen the same in Australia with the mining industry heading off a resource rent tax with a $20 million investment in TV ads. Surely, to me, that's the problem. I was shocked recently to find that the sustainable option in my public sector super included investing in ExxonMobil, BHP, and banks. And it seems to me that until we can turn around that finance sector inertia in favour of the fossil fuel status quo, we're really just yapping at the margins.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, a couple of points there. One, the Rockefeller Foundation, who, and all their money came from oil and gas, has recently decided to de-invest in all fossil fuel investments. And there's certainly that campaign around the world of de-investment. There's also just a huge amount of subsidies of fossil fuel industries, like we're talking about. If we could eliminate the subsidies, I think then renewable energy would take off significantly. If we eliminated the subsidies and actually charged the full cost of fossil fuels, it would be a mad rush to solar and wind power. But I could send you a paper that came out recently that demonstrated statistically that the United States is not a democracy, and I think we could probably make the same statistical case for Australia. But that's part of the problem. How do we actually get a real democracy? And I think this scenario planning might help, but we certainly need to get past private funding of campaigns and that makes it into a plutocracy, not a democracy. And I think that's one of the key challenges and changes that need to happen. How will that happen? I think it will, because I think there is public distrust and disappointment and recognition that it isn't a democracy. The 99% are beginning to, get the message. And, the Occupy movement, I think, was just one manifestation of that, but I think it just demonstrates that there is a large community out there that is dissatisfied with the way things are going. What we need, I think, is to present a viable alternative that says, here's a better way, here's an option to get on board to and be positive about, rather than simply being negative about what's currently happening.
I'll try it without the microphone. I was just wondering, within your global analysis, if you have come across any patterns of successful societies. Have you found that there are characters of societies that make them more sustainable, or make them have more higher GPI, and which essentially other countries learn from to make their societies more sustainable?
Yeah. That's a really good question, and I think that's kind of the agenda of this Future Earth initiative called I Hope, the Integrated History and Future of People on Earth. And the Maya analysis was sort of part of that. And what we did there was to say, well, what could the Maya have done differently? Could they have been sustainable? What would they have had to have changed? And at least in the model, it turns out that it wasn't any one thing. It was all, it was a whole package of policies. They would have had to limit population growth, limit depletion of natural capital, and limit the trade network, all at the same time. And that was the only thing that would work to allow them to become sustainable. There are a couple of examples. If you read Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, he talks about the Tokugawa period in Japan as being a sort of sustainable society, although it was very top-down, kind of control. But there are certainly other ways to do it. And I think that's, going forward, I think the scenario planning idea is a way to sort of paint those pictures of what alternative ways there might be. But historically, I think there have probably been more examples of collapse than there have been of sustainability. So we can certainly learn from those mistakes about what not to do. But designing a society that really is sustainable, I think, is going to be more of a challenge.
Well, I think it's pretty clear from all the questions that Bob's talk was a really stimulating and inspiring one. And I'd like you to join with me in thanking Bob. We have a little gift to give you. Thank you very much. So please join with me in thanking Bob.